age-old controversy, and it's bashing the bard.
It portrays William Shakespeare as a fraud who really did not write all those incredible plays and sonnets. So who did?
Well, CBS News correspondent Seth Doan takes a look.
There's no question William Shakespeare is considered among the best playwrights ever. He's celebrated here on Literary Walk in New York's Central Park. But were those words really his? A theory that's persisted among a small group of people is now being catapulted to the big screen.
What if I told you Shakespeare never wrote a single word?
And I'd like to talk to you about William Shakespeare. More specifically, I'd like to talk to you about the Shakespeare authorship question and an interesting document called the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt about the identity of William Shakespeare.
The more I think like William Shakespeare has not written these works. Actually had nothing to do with it.
Was the 17th Earl of Oxford, arguing that in those days writing plays wasn't considered worthy of royalty, so Shakespeare was simply a stand-in.
In my world, one does not write plays.
I've put my hands on the actual documents, and I've held them and I've read them.
Columbia University professor James Shapiro spent 30 years studying the bard, even writing the book Contested Will about Shakespeare's identity. He's mystified that so many intelligent people, even some Supreme Court justices, could doubt Shakespeare's legitimacy.
We're in America that loves conspiracy theory. We love to think that there's a mystery when the facts, as we have them, are far more extraordinary.
Listen to this. Not a single manuscript or poem was ever found in William Shakespeare's own handwriting. Not even a letter. And this from a man who is known to have divided his time between London and Stratford. Wouldn't that normally have produced a vast amount of correspondence? If you're away from home for so long, maybe a little note to his wife asking, "How are the kids?" The largest literary hunt in history produced not a single handwritten note of William Shakespeare. Strange, right?
I was astonished to learn there are no plays, poems, or even any letters in Shakespeare's own hand. Perhaps all the manuscripts of the plays and poems were lost or discarded, but no letters. Why was I never told this? Shakespeare was not only a great writer, he was a brilliant scholar. His works include extensive knowledge of law, philosophy, classical literature, ancient and modern history, art, astronomy, mathematics, music, medicine, military and naval terminology, English, French, and Italian court life, a virtual encyclopedia of knowledge. How could Shakespeare have learned so much about so many subjects without corresponding with others? And he divided his time between London and Stratford, a situation that called for correspondence. Well, he must have written dozens of letters, maybe hundreds. How could every last letter ever written by Shakespeare have been lost? And what about books?
William Shakespeare was born in the small town of Stratford upon Avon to illiterate parents. I have no problem with that. A lot of people come from tough beginnings and move on to great things. But what I find hard to explain is the fact that both of his daughters, Susanna and Judith, couldn't read or write either. Isn't it incredible that the writer of some of the greatest pieces of literature, the writer of King Lear, wouldn't want his children to read his plays or sonnets? Doesn't work for me. Will Shakespeare of Stratford was not a member of the upper classes. Everybody agrees on that. Then why did he write so obsessively about the aristocracy, about kings and queens and the life at court? And more importantly, how was he so familiar with their ways? Just take a look at Ben Jonson, also a commoner. His plays pretty much reflect the perspective of the working man. With Shakespeare, it's just the opposite. He apparently mocks his peers by giving them silly names like Bottom, Dull, or Mistress Overdone. Was Shakespeare a traitor to his own class? Check this one out. The only handwriting we have of William Shakespeare are actually 6 shaky and inconsistent signatures, all on legal documents. It seems that the poor man had difficulties signing his own name. But let's compare him to his colleagues, Kit Marlowe, Francis Bacon, and Ben Jonson. I think true penmanship. Isn't it hard to believe that William Shakespeare had so little experience with a quill? Now, I believe writing comes from the heart. So I'm asking myself, why doesn't a single play or poem by William Shakespeare reflect the life of the man from Stratford? For example, Shakespeare pours his heart out in his sonnets, but never mentions the death of his 11-year-old son. On the other hand, Ben Jonson wrote a beautiful poem when his child died. Or think about Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Or in our times, John Lennon wrote his song Julia about his mother. Call me a romantic, but I believe that great artists are inspired by their life. But obviously not the man.
But wait, what about Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I? Now, we've all seen movies where Elizabeth adores Shakespeare's plays and talks to him about them. Or did she? Contrary to the popular perception that Shakespeare became a prominent public figure, there's no record Elizabeth I ever met Shakespeare or spoke or wrote his name. And if anyone ever spoke to Shakespeare about his writing or anything in any of his plays, there's no record of that either. In fact, no one seems to have thought of Shakespeare of Stratford as a poet or a playwright during his lifetime. And when he died in 1616, no one seemed to notice. As Mark Twain wrote in his work, Is Shakespeare Dead? Shakespeare's the best known unknown person that has ever drawn breath upon the planet.
No records prove that Shakespeare ever attended the Stratford Grammar School. Yet the work of William Shakespeare, the writer, shows extensive knowledge of medicine, astronomy, art, music, military, law, and philosophy, as well as aristocratic activities such as royal tennis and falconry. Call me a snob, but even if he was a genius, he couldn't have pulled that one off without leaving at least a trace of his learning. After all, William Shakespeare had the largest English vocabulary of any writer in history.
Nearly all of Shakespeare's plays are based on other works, many not yet translated into English at the time. Well, he must have had an extensive library that included these source works. But once again, no. Not a single book belonging to Shakespeare has ever been found. Books were valuable possessions back then. What happened to all of Shakespeare's books? So no play, no poem, no letter in Shakespeare's own hand, and no book belonging to Shakespeare or that's known to have been in his possession. In fact, Shakespeare's long and detailed will, which we do have, makes no mention of his being a writer and no mention of any possession that suggests in any way that he was. Why was I never told this?
Here is a big one for me. We know that William Shakespeare retired in his late 40s and returned to the same little town where he grew up. There, he never wrote a single poem, play, or sonnet again. I would never compare myself to Shakespeare, but for me, the idea of retiring from directing and moving back to my hometown and never to be associated with movies again is just completely unthinkable. So what happened? Did William Shakespeare run out of ideas? No record shows that William Shakespeare of Stratford ever traveled beyond the borders of his home country, England. Yet Shakespeare's work references Italian cities in great detail, French court life, as well as etiquette and manners of the nobility in foreign lands. How did the author gain all this specific knowledge about countries he never visited? Let's remember, a third of William Shakespeare's plays are set in Italy. Let's take a look at the Stratford Monument. It shows the man himself in all his glory, holding a quill and parchment. However, historians agree that there were renovations done on Shakespeare's image. Take a look. An early engravement of the same monument shows our poet holding a sack of grain, rather than a writing tool. Can you believe that the last will of William Shakespeare of Stratford does not mention any books or manuscripts? Nothing that would indicate that he was the author of 36 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 famous poems. Didn't he care what would happen to his life's work after his death? In his testament, he obviously cared more for his second-best bed that he famously left to his wife.
Mark Twain doubted that Shakespeare wrote the works, as did other great writers and thinkers. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, William and Henry James, Sigmund Freud, and actors Orson Welles, John Gielgud, Derek Jacobi, Michael York, Jeremy Irons, Vanessa Redgrave, and Mark Rylance, the founding artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, to name a few. Why was I never told this? The main reason why I was never told any of these startling facts about William Shakespeare is that most Shakespeare scholars say there's no doubt who wrote the works. They claim there's no legitimate controversy, and most teachers understandably accept this. With all due respect, there's many who disagree. In addition to the writers, thinkers, and actors I've already mentioned, there are Supreme Court justices, hundreds of academics, and even a growing number of English professors, many of whom have signed the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. If Shakespeare is so important that almost everyone studies his great plays and poems, then he's important enough for us to know there's doubt about who he really was. We should all know some basic facts about this fascinating topic.
Shapiro says the film does not present any evidence.
Only Will Shakespeare can pump the life into Romeo's veins.
but there's no doubt it does spark conversation. Seth Doan, CBS News, New York.